Welcome to Wisdom for the Present, where we take ancient truth and bring it into clear, modern understanding. This episode uses AI-generated narration based on human-researched and written material.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to dig into this one.
Yeah, it's going to be great. So I want to start by asking you to imagine, for just a moment, voluntarily undergoing a primitive, agonizing medical procedure without anesthesia, and doing this simply to reverse a physical marker of your heritage.
Right, which sounds insane today.
Completely. And imagine doing this not because, someone held a sword to your throat, but just because you wanted to gain access to the right local networking club. You wanted to work out at the ancient equivalent of the most exclusive gym in town. Also, you could finally fit in with the new global empire.
It's a terrifying level of desperation, really.
It is. And that is exactly how desperate people were to assimilate in the year 167 BC.
Yeah, it's a profoundly heavy era to examine. The desperation to just fit into a dominant culture is something that echoes so loudly into our present day.
Absolutely. So we are jumping into an incredibly rich and, frankly, sometimes really shocking ancient text today. It's the first book of Maccabees, specifically chapters 1 through 9, verse 22.
A very specific slice.
Right. And our mission for this deep dive is to act as thoughtful guides through this material. We really want to help you, the listener, extract the practical wisdom, the moral insight, and the real-world life applications from a book that, honestly, it reads like a geopolitical thriller.
It really does. But, to truly mine the wisdom from these chapters, we have to start by building the world the author inhabited.
Right. Set the stage for us.
So, First Maccabees was written in Hebrew somewhere between 170 BC. But it documents a crisis that erupted a few decades prior to that, spanning roughly 167 to 160 BC. And to understand that crisis, you kind of have to look at the shadow cast by a man who had already been dead for over a century, which is Alexander the Great. Man,
Alexander the Great conquering the known world always seems to be the inciting incident for so much of ancient history.
Always, right?
But by 167 BC, his empire had been fractured for a really long time, hasn't it?
Oh, it had been shattered, yeah. When Alexander died in 323 BC, he didn't leave a clear heir. So his massive empire was just carved up by his generals.
The Diadochi.
Exactly,
right?
The successors. And over the generations, two dominant rival kingdoms emerged in the Middle East. You had the Ptolemaic dynasty ruling down in Egypt, and the Seleucid dynasty ruling up in Syria and Mesopotamia.
And if you look at a map, right between Egypt and Syria, acting as this incredibly narrow land bridge, is the land of Judea.
Precisely. Judea was the highway.
Right.
If the Ptolemies and the Seleucids wanted to trade, or, more often, if they wanted to go to war, they had to march right through Judea.
It's a terrible place to live if you hate traffic and invading armies.
Right. So for about a century and a half, the Ptolemies controlled this region. And the Judeans enjoyed a relative amount of religious and cultural freedom under them, provided they just pay their taxes.
Keep your head down, pay the bill, you're fine.
Exactly. But around 200 BC, the Seleucid Empire pushed south and took control of Judea. And eventually, a Seleucid king named Antiochus the Epiphanes comes to power.
Okay, so he is the primary antagonist of this narrative. But before we get into what Antiochus actually does, I think we need to address the nature of the book itself, because it sits in a very unique category, doesn't it?
It does, yes.
First Maccabees is part of the Apocrypha. For someone who might only be familiar with the standard modern Bible, what exactly does that mean?
Well, the term Apocrypha generally refers to a collection of texts written during what we call the intertestamental period.
The silent years, some people call it.
Yeah, that roughly 400-year gap between the end of the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, and the beginning of the New Testament.
Right, okay.
These books were included in the Septuagint, which was the ancient Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures. And they're actually still considered canonical by Catholic and Orthodox traditions.
Got it.
However, they weren't included in the later finalized Hebrew canon, the Masoretic text. And subsequently, Protestant traditions usually place them in a separate section, or just omit them entirely.
Okay, so it's a revered, deeply significant religious and historical text, even if different traditions view its exact canonical status a little differently.
Exactly. It's a foundational text for understanding that era.
But reading through the source material, I noticed a literary quirk that completely stopped me in my tracks.
The name.
Yes. In this highly revered ancient religious text detailing essentially a holy war, the author never mentions God by name. not once in the entire book.
It is a really remarkable stylistic choice. Instead of using the divine name, the author consistently uses a substitute word. They use the word heaven.
I have to admit that feels like a huge contradiction. I mean, how do you write an entire religious history without naming the deity at the center of the religion?
It seems wild, right?
Yeah.
But it actually reflects a profound theological and psychological evolution that was occurring in the ancient world at that time. Well, first, there was this growing reverence, right? A disinclination to utter or write the sacred name of God out of a really deep sense of his transcendent holiness.
Okay, so it's out of respect.
Yes. But it's also a shift in perspective. The divine was becoming viewed as more elevated, more cosmic, rather than a localized deity you could just, call down to fix your immediate everyday problems.
So they weren't expecting a localized, immediate miracle anymore. You don't see the Red Sea parting in this book.
You don't. You really don't. In older texts, the narrative often relies on immediate, spectacular divine intervention, right?
Fire falling from the sky, walls collapsing at the sound of a trumpet.
Plagues wiping out enemy camps overnight, exactly. But in First Maccabees, the theology shifts its weight heavily onto human agency.
That's fascinating.
The belief embedded in this text is that divine providence, heaven, operates primarily through the courage, the strategy, and literal actions of human beings.
So it's essentially the ancient embodiment of the idea that heaven helps those who help themselves.
That is the absolute philosophical core of the book. It's a deeply pragmatic approach to faith and to survival.
Wow.
The author rejects pure secular skepticism. They clearly believe in a divine order and covenant, but they equally reject fatalism. They do not believe you can just sit in a cave, pray, and expect the Syrian Empire to magically disappear.
You actually have to pick up a sword.
You have to do the work.
Which brings us right into the living room of anyone listening to this deep dive today, because we are looking at a story about human beings thrust into an agonizing cultural meat grinder.
That's a great way to put it.
They have to make hard choices. They are facing a massive globalized superpower that demands they assimilate and erase what makes them unique. And that is a dynamic that translates so seamlessly into our modern lives, even if the stakes look totally different.
Oh, absolutely. And the mechanism of that pressure is detailed right at the beginning of chapter 1.
Let's get into it.
So Antiochus Epiphanes, this Seleucid king, he needs to consolidate his power.
Why? What's threatening him?
Well, the Seleucid Empire had actually suffered a massive defeat by the rising Roman Republic a few decades prior.
Rome is already entering the chat.
They are. And they demanded crippling financial indemnities. So Antiochus is desperate for cash and control. He realizes that managing a huge, diverse empire with different local laws, different temples, and different cultures is just incredibly inefficient and expensive.
So he decides to flatten the culture. He issues a decree.
A decree that all should be one people.
On the surface, if you strip away the historical dread of that moment, all should be one people. It sounds like a beautiful utopian ideal. It sounds like world peace.
Right. The rhetoric of empires always sounds utopian. It's a feature, not a bug.
Yeah.
But the reality wasn't about unity. It was about uniformity. Antiochus wanted to eradicate the unique cultural, legal, and religious identity of Judea, because a distinct people are just harder to tax and harder to control.
That makes total sense from an imperial perspective.
So he decrees that everyone must abandon their ancestral laws. He outlaws their traditional sacrifices, he completely bans the observance of the Sabbath, and he makes it a capital offense to possess their sacred texts.
Just a total crackdown.
Total. And eventually, he desecrates the sanctuary in Jerusalem by setting up an altar to a pagan god right on top of the holy altar.
It's a brutal, systematic cultural erasure. But, when you read the text closely, the most uncomfortable part of chapter 1 isn't actually what the king did.
No, it's not.
It's what the Judeans did before the king ever issued his violent decrees. Because the initial loss of identity wasn't forced at the point of a sword, it was eagerly requested by a faction within the community.
Yeah, the text points to lawless men who came out of Israel and persuaded many. And their argument was essentially an economic and a social one.
What did they say?
They said, "Let us go and make a covenant with the nations that are round about us. For since we separated ourselves from them, many evils have come upon us."
That is a staggering admission. They're just tired.
They were exhausted.
They were exhausted by the daily grinding friction of being different from the surrounding dominant culture.
They traded their heritage for convenience. They really wanted the safety and the social mobility that came with being culturally Greek or, Hellenized.
Because Hellenization wasn't just about wearing different clothes.
Yeah. It was an entire civic, economic and philosophical system. If you wanted to participate in international trade, if you wanted civic rights in the new cities Antiochus was building, you basically had to adopt Greek customs.
It was the price of admission.
Exactly. And the Judeans willingly went to the king to secure a license to do exactly that.
And the text gives us a physical anchor for this assimilation, which I found fascinating. It notes that they built a gymnasium in Jerusalem.
Yes, the gymnasium.
Now, the word gymnasium is super tricky for modern readers because we picture a room with a rubber floor, some free weights, and a couple of stationary bikes. But an ancient Greek gymnasium was an entirely different institution.
It really was. It was the absolute epicenter of Hellenistic life. Yes, it was a place for athletic training, but it was also the center of education, philosophy, and political socialization.
So it's more like an elite university mixed with a country club.
Exactly. It was where the youth were molded into Greek citizens. It was the ultimate networking hub for the upwardly mobile elite.
But there's a physical catch that makes this particularly agonizing for the Judeans in this specific story.
Right. And it has to do with how they trained. The athletic training in a Greek gymnasium was performed entirely naked.
Right.
So for a Jewish man, participating in the gymnasium meant physically exposing his circumcision, which is the literal bodily mark of his ancestral covenant with his God, to the public ridicule of his Greek peers.
Because the Greeks idealize the unblemished natural male body.
Exactly. They saw circumcision as a barbaric mutilation. So the pressure to fit in, to avoid being mocked as a barbarian, was so incredibly intense that the text records these men undergoing painful, rudimentary surgical procedures to reverse their circumcisions.
Which is just, I can't even fathom the pain of that, especially back then.
Epispasm, it was called. They literally became uncircumcised. They altered their own physical bodies to erase the evidence of who they were.
That is where the hook we opened with comes from. It's just wild. And the author of First Maccabees delivers a really ruthless verdict on this behavior. The text states that they sold themselves to do evil.
Because the ultimate tragedy of chapter 1 is that this voluntary, eager assimilation paved the road for the violent oppression that followed.
Oh, wow. How so?
Well, by voluntarily giving up their distinct identity just to fit into the empire's economic system, they signaled to Antiochus that their culture was entirely negotiable. They essentially invited the empire in.
They showed their belly.
They did.
And this maps so perfectly onto the subtle creep of modern conformity. Think about the empires we interact with today. Obviously, it isn't a Seleucid king anymore.
No, thankfully.
But it's the algorithm of a social media platform, or the hyper-competitive culture of a specific corporate industry, or even just the dominant political tribe in our neighborhood.
Right.
And so often, we slowly, unconsciously shave off our unique edges. We change our opinions, we curate our online personas, we adopt the jargon and the outrage of the crowd just to fit the algorithm.
It's so true. We build our own gymnasiums, essentially, to ensure we get a seat at the table. We prioritize the convenience of blending in over the friction of standing for something distinct.
But this raises a massive practical question for us. We don't live in a vacuum, right? We have to interact with different cultures, work in diverse companies, and exist in a highly globalized world. The goal of this wisdom isn't to tell people to go live in an isolated commune in the woods.
Not at all. The distinction the text is drawing is between healthy cultural engagement and soul-destroying assimilation.
Okay, unpack that.
Engaging with the wider world, learning from it, and trading with it is one thing. But the text is fiercely warning against the mindset that says, I will fundamentally alter my core values. I will erase my foundational identity merely to avoid the discomfort of standing out.
Right. So translating this directly to you, the listener, right now in the 21st century, how do you exist in a highly connected culture without losing yourself?
That's the challenge.
And the practice here is to identify your non-negotiables.
Yeah.
You really have to locate your personal gymnasium.
I love that.
Where are you quietly compromising a core belief just to avoid the friction of being different? Is it at work where you stay silent during unethical decisions because you want that promotion?
Or is it online, right?
Yeah.
Where you project a lifestyle or an opinion that completely contradicts your actual values just to chase engagement metrics?
Exactly. It is a profound reflection because giving away your identity rarely happens all at once. It happens in these tiny negotiated increments.
You laugh at the joke you know is wrong.
Right. You agree with the consensus you know is flawed.
You sacrifice a little bit of truth for a little bit of comfort over and over again.
But the narrative shifts gears drastically when that subtle social pressure turns into a hard, violent mandate. The empire stops asking, and starts demanding. And that brings us to the end of chapter 2, and a man named Mattathias.
Yes. So the enforcement of Antiochus's decree reaches a small rural town called Modudan.
Okay.
The king's officers are traveling town by town, systematically forcing the local Jewish leaders to publicly offer pagan sacrifices, basically proving their loyalty to the new cultural order.
His loyalty test.
Exactly. And they approach Mattathias. He's an elder, a respected priest, a man with 5 adult sons. He's a pillar of the community.
And the officers offer him what basically amounts to an ancient corporate buyout.
That's a perfect analogy. They promise him immense wealth, silver and gold, but more importantly, they offer him the official title of the king's friend.
Which, I mean, that sounds like a casual phrase, but it was an official political designation, right?
Oh, absolutely. Friends of the king was a formal aristocratic rank within the Hellenistic empires. It granted you direct access to the royal court, political immunity, and immense social power.
So it's not just a pat on the back.
No, the officers are essentially saying, look, Mattathias, everyone else is doing this. Your nation is already capitulating. Just step up to this altar, burn a little incense, make the sacrifice, and you and your 5 sons will be set for life. You will be part of the ruling elite.
It's the ultimate temptation. Just perform a minor, seemingly meaningless ritual and secure your family's future forever.
But Mattathias doesn't just decline the offer. He makes a loud, highly public declaration of defiance.
What does he say?
He says, though all the nations that are under the king's dominion obey him and fall away every one from the religion of their fathers, yet will I and my sons and my brethren walk in the covenant of our fathers.
Man, that is a stunning refusal.
It really is.
But the situation immediately escalates into absolute chaos. Because right after Mattathias gives this beautiful, principled speech, another Judean man steps forward, perfectly willing to make the pagan sacrifice to save his own skin.
And perhaps to claim the reward that Mattathias just rejected.
Exactly. And this is where modern readers hit a massive obstacle in the text. Because Mattathias absolutely snaps.
He does. The text describes a very visceral reaction. It says his zeal was kindled and his heart quivered.
Wow.
In a sudden burst of righteous fury, Mattathias runs to the altar, draws a weapon, and murders the Judean man who was about to sacrifice.
Wait, really? Just right there on the spot?
Right there. And he doesn't stop there. He then turns, kills the king's commissioner, and physically tears the pagan altar to the ground.
Okay, we have to stop the narrative right here.
Yeah.
He literally murders a man at the altar.
Yes, he does.
For anyone listening today, this scene is deeply alienating. We recoil from this. We see a man using lethal violence over a religious ritual, and our modern framework immediately categorizes this as religious extremism, fanaticism, maybe even terrorism.
Oh, absolutely.
So how are we supposed to extract practical, modern wisdom from an ancient man committing a public execution?
It is arguably the most challenging tension in the whole book.
Yeah.
To understand it, we really have to impartially step into the ancient mindset while still maintaining our modern discernment.
Okay, walk us through that mindset.
In the ancient world, particularly in this specific covenantal community, there was simply no concept of the separation of church and state or personal religion versus public duty.
Those lines didn't exist.
They didn't exist at all. The survival of the community was inextricably tied to their covenant with the divine. To publicly abandon that covenant wasn't just like a personal lifestyle choice. It was viewed as introducing a spiritual rot that would condemn the entire community to physical and divine destruction.
So, to Mattathias, that man stepping up to the altar wasn't just exercising his personal freedom of religion.
Yeah.
He was pulling the trigger on the destruction of their entire society.
That is exactly the ancient logic at play. And the author of First Maccabees explicitly praises Mattathias for this violent act by comparing him to the biblical figure Phinehas.
Who was that?
Phinehas was an ancient zealot from the Torah who also used lethal violence to stop a plague from wiping out the Israelites. So in the logic of this text, extreme existential threats require extreme uncompromising zeal.
Okay, so here is how we use wisdom with discernment. We live in a modern society governed by the rule of law. We unequivocally do not endorse the ancient violence.
Right, obviously not.
But if we dig beneath the bloodshed, there is a profound psychological and moral truth about the necessity of drawing absolute boundaries.
I agree. And what does that boundary look like in a modern context?
Well, it looks like the moment of absolute uncompromising refusal. In modern life, we rarely face someone holding a sword to our neck, right? But we constantly negotiate with toxic, degrading situations. We stay in abusive relationships because we fear the chaos of leaving. We remain in jobs that demand unethical behavior because the salary is fantastic. We basically want the silver and gold the king's officers are offering.
We want the title.
Yes, we rationalize it. We tell ourselves, I'll just burn a little incense. I'll just compromise this one time, sign off on this one shady report, tolerate this one toxic comment just to keep the peace.
We tolerate the intolerable until it becomes our normal.
Exactly. And Mattathias represents the psychological breaking point where a person finally says, no, not one step further. I don't care what it costs me.
He drew a line in the sand that was etched in stone.
Right. And that is the practice for the listener here. You have to define your absolute no. What is the boundary in your professional or personal life that, if crossed, requires you to immediately walk away, flip the table, or blow the whistle, regardless of the financial or social fallout?
Because if you haven't defined your absolute no in advance,
the pressure of the moment will eventually force you to say yes to everything.
It really will. And that absolute refusal in Modin, it sparks a massive insurgency. Mattathias and his sons realize they obviously can't stay in town after killing the king's commissioner.
Yeah, that bridge is burned.
Utterly burned. So they flee into the rugged mountains and the wilderness, leaving all their wealth and property behind. And other Judeans who want to resist assimilation begin to follow them.
But what is truly fascinating about Mattathias is the contrast between his actions. In Modin, he draws this hard, absolute, violent line regarding a sacred law.
Right.
But his very next major leadership decision out in the wilderness requires him to actually bend a sacred rule.
Yes. This brings us to one of the most brilliant demonstrations of pragmatic leadership in the ancient world.
Set the scene for us.
So while Mattathias is hiding in the mountains, there's another group of Judean refugees, about 1,000 men, women, and children, and they're hiding in caves in the wilderness. The Syrian army tracks them down. And the Syrian commanders, knowing the religious laws of their enemy perfectly well, are incredibly cynical. They intentionally wait until the Sabbath day to launch their attack.
Oh, that is brutal. Because according to the strictest, most fundamental interpretation of the law of Moses, you cannot perform any labor on the Sabbath.
Exactly.
And fighting a battle, swinging a sword, moving rocks to defend a cave, that is undeniably labor.
It's labor. And the text describes a scene of just sheer devastating tragedy. The Syrian army attacks the caves, and these 1,000 Judeans refuse to lift a single finger to defend themselves.
Wow.
The text says, they answer them not, neither cast they a stone at them, nor stop the places where they lay hid. They simply call out to heaven, saying they will die in their innocence, and they literally allow themselves to be slaughtered.
1,000 people.
1,000 people wiped out without a single casualty on the enemy side.
That is horrifying.
It is. And when Mattathias and his friends hear about this massacre, they mourn bitterly. But they also realize that if they maintain this rigid interpretation of the law, the rebellion is over before it begins. They'll all just be picked off every Saturday.
So they have to make a choice.
They hold a council and issue a pragmatic decree that completely changes the trajectory of the war. They declare, "Whosoever shall come to make battle with us on the Sabbath day, we will fight against him. Neither will we die all, as our brethren that were murdered in the secret places."
It is a stunning pivot. Mattathias looks at a sacred, foundational law of his people, a law literally written on tablets of stone, and he realizes that rigid adherence to it in this specific, extreme context has transformed it into a suicide pact.
He recognizes that the original intent of the law was to preserve and cultivate life, not to mandate the extermination of the people it was actually meant to guide.
He distinguishes between the letter of the law and the spirit of the law.
Exactly, which is the hallmark of profound wisdom.
Think about this in the context of modern organizations. It is exactly like a legacy company that has a strict standard operating procedure.
Yeah.
We never, ever deploy code on a Friday or work on a weekend.
Right, a classic tech rule.
But suddenly, there is a massive cyber attack on a Saturday morning that is deleting all of their customer data. You can't just sit there saying, well, the handbook says we don't work weekends.
You have to put the fire out.
You have to put the fire out. Businesses go bankrupt all the time because they treat a procedural rule as if it were a sacred idol, even when the market has completely shifted.
And it takes immense courage to break a precedent you revere. Mattathias realizes that if they all allow themselves to be killed to keep the Sabbath perfectly this week, there will literally be no one left alive to keep the Sabbath next week.
So how do we apply this? I think we have to examine our own dogmatic thinking. Because we all have self-imposed Sabbath rules.
We do.
These are rigid routines, strict habits, or ideological stances that we cling to, often wearing them like a badge of honor. Maybe your rule is that you never quit a project once you started it, because quitting is for losers.
Or maybe you have a rigid rule that to be a successful entrepreneur, you just must wake up at 4:30 a.m. every single day.
Right. But what if that project you refuse to quit is now actively draining your family's savings and destroying your mental health?
Or what if that 4:30 a.m. wake-up call is causing chronic sleep deprivation because your actual life requires you to work late into the evening?
Exactly. We defend these self-imposed rules to our own detriment. We allow our progress, our health, or our relationships to be slaughtered by our own stubbornness. So, a question for you to reflect on. What is a dogmatic rule in your life, or perhaps a rigid policy in your organization, that you are fiercely defending even though it is actively harming you?
Where do you need the courage of Mattathias to pivot?
Where do you need to look at your routine and say, the rule was made to serve me. I wasn't made to blindly serve the rule.
It's so vital. And by adapting the rules of engagement, the insurgency survives. But, Mattathias is an old man. The physical toll of living in the mountains catches up with him.
Sure.
At the end of chapter 2, he gathers his sons, delivers a final, passionate charge for them to be zealous for the law, and he dies. The torch of leadership is passed.
And he passes the military command to his son, Judas, who is surnamed Maccabeus.
Yes.
Now, the name Maccabeus likely means the hammer, right?
That's the most common translation, yes.
Yeah.
The hammer. And the text shifts into a highly poetic, almost epic register to describe him.
How so?
The author describes Judas putting on his breastplate like a giant and roaring like a lion hunting for prey. He is framed as this larger-than-life warrior.
Well, he needed to be a lion because the pragmatic survival tactics of his father aren't going to be enough anymore. The Seleucid Empire realizes this isn't just a minor localized riot, it's a full-blown revolution.
Exactly.
And they start sending massive professional armies to crush him. First, a general named Apollonius comes down.
Right. And Judas actually defeats Apollonius in their first major engagement. And the text includes a highly symbolic detail here.
What's that?
Judas strips the armor from Apollonius, takes his sword, and fights with that specific sword for the rest of his life.
Wow, it's the ultimate symbol of resourcefulness. He takes the primary weapon of the empire and turns it directly against them.
He really does. But the defining moment of Judas's leadership style, the moment that truly reveals his mindset, happens shortly after this, before the Battle of Betharon.
Okay, tell us about Betharon.
So a Syrian prince named Saron marches down with a massive, heavily armed host.
Yeah.
Judas has a tiny, ragtag company of insurgents. They are in the mountains, the terrain is steep, and the text notes that Judas's men are starving.
They're starving.
Yeah, they are ready to faint with fasting all this day. They look down at the sheer size and equipment of the enemy army, and psychological terror just sets in.
Naturally.
They say to Judas, "How shall we be able, being so few, to fight against so great a multitude and so strong?"
It is the ultimate imposter syndrome moment. You look at the massive obstacle in front of you, the competition, the market forces, the sheer scale of a problem, and you just feel incredibly small.
We just want to quit.
You want to quit. And how does Judas respond to this panic?
He delivers a masterful speech that perfectly encapsulates that theological shift we discussed at the beginning of the episode.
Yeah, about heaven.
Yes. He says, "It is no hard matter for many to be shut up in the hands of a few. And with the God of heaven it is all one, to deliver with a great multitude or a small company. For the victory of battle standeth not in the multitude of an host, but strength cometh from heaven."
Strength cometh from heaven.
But remember, this isn't a call to sit back and wait for lightning bolts to strike Saron's army.
No, not at all.
It reminds me of how a professional athlete or a master litigator prepares for a massive event. You do every single thing within your physical and mental power to prepare. You study the tape, you run the drills, you draft the briefs. But when the moment finally arrives, you have to let go of the anxiety about the final outcome. You trust the preparation and surrender the result.
Exactly. That is the exact dynamic Judas embodies.
What is deeply revealing is the action that immediately follows his speech. The text explicitly says that as soon as he finishes speaking, he leaps suddenly upon the enemy.
He doesn't even pause.
He doesn't wait for a sign. He attacks with ferocious speed where they're still marching up the ascent.
It is the fusion of ultimate faith and ultimate preparation. And we see this combination even more clearly in his next massive battle at Emmaus against a general named Gorgias.
Oh, the Battle of Emmaus is a tactical masterclass.
Break it down for us.
So Gorgias brings a massive army, and he tries to be clever. He takes a detachment of his best men and marches at night to launch a surprise attack on Judas's camp in the mountains.
Trying to catch them sleeping.
Right. But Judas has scouts. He knows Gorgias is coming.
Right.
So Judas leaves his campfires burning to make it look like his men are still there, but he actually marches his entire army out in the middle of the night, down into the plains, right toward the main Syrian camp that Gorgias just left behind.
That is brilliant.
And before they attack, the text says they fasted, they put on sackcloth, they prayed, and they sounded the trumpets.
And then, after all the spiritual preparation, Judas gets to work. He organizes his men into a strict military hierarchy, captains over thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens.
He literally builds a corporate organizational chart in the middle of the night.
I love that. He doesn't let his faith replace his strategy. His faith fuels his strategy.
Precisely. He strikes the main Syrian camp at dawn, utterly routing them. And when Gorgias, who has been wandering around in the mountains looking for an empty camp, looks down into the plain, he sees his own base on fire.
Game over.
The psychological shock completely breaks the rest of the Syrian army and they flee.
So, bringing this into modern translation, how do we combat burnout and the paralysis of facing impossible odds? Maybe you are an independent creator trying to compete with a massive media conglomerate. Maybe you're a patient staring down a terrifying, complex medical diagnosis. Or maybe you are an activist fighting a societal injustice that seems as entrenched as an ancient empire.
The natural temptation is always to look at the multitude of the host arrayed against you in despair, to think you need equal numbers, an equal budget, or equal political power to even stand a chance.
But Judas proves that victory doesn't stand in the multitude. You don't need a massive host. You need clarity of purpose, a tight, highly disciplined team, and sudden, decisive action.
Yes.
When you are overwhelmed by the sheer size of your obstacles, stop staring at the enemy's numbers. Prepare your small company. Do the deep organizational work. Get your mind right through meditation, prayer, or whatever grounds you. And then stop waiting for perfect conditions and leap upon the problem. Take one decisive action.
I think that's a beautiful way to frame it, but taking action requires the right motivations.
Right.
A brilliant strategy deployed for the wrong reasons is just a recipe for disaster.
Yeah.
And First Maccabees is remarkably honest about the flaws of its own people, actually. Which brings us to a devastating failure of leadership in Chapter 5.
Chapter 5 is a masterclass in how ego destroys a mission.
It really is.
The context here is that the conflict has widened significantly, hasn't it?
Yeah, it's no longer just Judas fighting the main Syrian armies. Neighboring nations have started attacking isolated Jewish communities in regions like Gilead and Galilee.
Okay, so a two-front war.
Exactly. Judas and his brothers, Jonathan and Simon, are constantly on the move, running rapid rescue operations to save these besieged communities. And because he has to take his main forces north, Judas leaves a remnant of his army behind in Judea to protect the home front.
He puts two commanders in charge, Joseph and Azarias.
Yes. And Judas gives them incredibly explicit, unambiguous orders.
He says, "Take ye the charge of this people, and see that ye make not war against the heathen until the time that we come again."
Basically, stay put, hold the line, defend the people, but do not engage in offensive warfare.
Just play defense.
Right. But while Judas and his brothers are away, winning these spectacular legendary victories and saving thousands of people, Joseph and Azarias start getting restless sitting on sidelines.
And the author gives us a really clear window into their psychology here. They say to each other, "Let us also get us a name and go fight against the heathen that are round about us."
Let us also get us a name.
It is the ancient equivalent of middle management FOMO, fear of missing out. They see their bosses getting all the glory, getting their names written in the history books, and their egos literally can't handle it. They want a piece of the action.
They could completely lose sight of their actual mission, which was the unglamorous work of guarding the people.
Right.
Driven purely by vanity, they marched their army out toward a city called Jamnia to pick a fight with a Syrian general named Gorgias.
The same general Judas had just defeated.
The very same.
And it is an absolute tactical and human disaster. Gorgias's forces come out to meet them, and because Joseph and Azarias are fighting a completely unnecessary war of aggression without the tactical brilliance of Judas, they are utterly routed.
They are chased all the way back to the borders of Judea. And the human cost is staggering. 2,000 men of Israel are killed that day.
2,000 lives lost, not to defend a town, not to protect the sanctuary, but simply because two men wanted to be famous.
It's sickening. And the author of the text doesn't mince words. He writes, Thus was there a great overthrow among the children of Israel, because they were not obedient unto Judas and his brethren, but thought to do some valiant act.
Action divorced from pure purpose is just vanity, and it gets people hurt. The author explicitly contrasts this ego-driven failure with the motivations of Judas.
How so?
Well, when Judas fights, the narrative always frames his actions around service-saving the people, protecting the sanctuary, defending the weak. His motivation is external. Joseph and Azarias' motivation was entirely internal and self-serving.
Yeah, if we pull this dynamic into the modern workplace, it is a pathology we see constantly.
Oh, it is everywhere. It is the executive who launches a massive, expensive corporate restructuring or a flashy new product line, not because it actually solves a customer problem or adds value to the company, but because they want a major launch on their resume.
I want to get a name in the industry press.
Exactly. Or the manager who picks unnecessary turf wars with other departments just to prove how tough they are to upper management. In doing so, they burn through the resources, the goodwill, and the morale of their entire team.
The 2,000 men lost in a modern context might be the mass layoffs that occur because a CEO pursued a glorious acquisition that made absolutely no financial sense.
Man, that's spot on. So before you launch into your next major conflict or pitch that massive new project or even just pick a fight on a social media platform, you really have to do a brutal audit of your own ego.
Ask yourself, am I doing this to protect my sanctuary and serve my community, or am I just trying to get a name?
Right. If your primary driver is the latter, you need to stand down. Have the maturity to hold the fort and do the unglamorous work of protecting what you already have.
It's hard to do, but it's essential. Ego can clearly lead to catastrophic military decisions. But, as the text shows us in Chapter 8, sheer weariness and exhaustion can lead to deeply flawed geopolitical decisions too.
Chapter 8. This is one of the most historically ironic chapters in the entire biblical corpus, honestly.
Oh, without a doubt.
Set it up for us. By this point, the Maccabean revolt has been raging for years.
Right. They've won miraculous victories, but the Seleucid Empire is a massive, relentless machine. They just keep printing new armies and sending them south.
Judas and his men have to be exhausted.
Deeply exhausted. And then Judas starts hearing rumors about a rising superpower far to the west, the Roman Republic.
And the author of First Maccabees dedicates the first 16 verses of chapter 8 to absolutely gushing about Rome. It is a fascinating piece of propaganda.
The praise is so idealistic, it borders on comical.
Right. Judas has heard that the Romans are mighty and valiant, that they crush kings from the uttermost parts of the earth, but crucially, that they are amazingly loyal to their friends.
Right, friends.
The text actually claims that the Roman Senate consists of 320 men who sit in council daily, that they entrust their government to one man a year, and that there is neither envy nor emulation among them.
Which, anyone with even a passing knowledge of Roman history knows how hilarious that last line is.
Right.
The Roman Senate was a viper's nest of ambition, bribery, backstabbing, and extreme envy. But we have to understand why the author wrote this.
They were looking at Rome through the lens of utter desperation.
Exactly. Rome was distant, powerful, and importantly, an enemy of the Seleucids. Judas and the author are projecting all their hopes for a savior onto this distant republic.
So Judas decides to act on this idealized vision. He selects 2 ambassadors, Eupolemus and Jason, and sends them on the long, dangerous journey to Rome to propose a league of amity and confederacy, a mutual defense pact.
Right. They arrive at the Senate, and the Romans, ever the geopolitical pragmatists, gladly agree. They write the treaty on brass tablets and send it back to Jerusalem. But
as a catch.
Always a catch with Rome. If you analyze the actual text of the treaty provided in the chapter, you immediately see the mechanics of Roman imperialism at play.
The loopholes are massive.
Huge. The treaty basically stipulates that if war comes to Rome, the Judeans must help Rome with all their heart, without receiving any pay or supplies.
Okay.
But if war comes to the Judeans, Rome will help them, as the occasion shall prescribe to them, and as it hath seemed good unto the Romans.
It's an entirely one-sided contract. Rome is essentially saying, we will absolutely let you die for us, and we might help you if it happens to align perfectly with our current strategic interests.
Exactly. Rome's entire strategy in the East was to weaken the Seleucid Empire without spending Roman blood or treasure. By signing a treaty with Judea, Rome legitimized the rebellion, basically turning Judea into a buffer state that would constantly bleed the Seleucid armies.
Rome didn't view Judea as a friend. They viewed them as a useful tool.
A speed bump for their enemies.
And here is where we must apply critical historical discernment, because the enduring wisdom of this chapter is a profound cautionary tale. We know how this specific historical timeline ends.
We do.
The author of First Maccabees, writing perhaps a century before the climax, didn't live to see it. But we know that this very Roman power, which they invited in as a protector, would eventually occupy Judea.
It'd strip away their hard-won independence.
Install puppet kings like Herod, and ultimately, in 70 AD, completely destroy the temple in Jerusalem.
By seeking external security, they invited the very force that would engineer their ultimate destruction.
It's exactly like a scrappy, independent tech startup that builds a brilliant product but is exhausted by the competition. So they partner with a massive trillion-dollar tech monopoly, thinking they are so powerful they will protect us from our mid-sized competitors.
Oh, that's a perfect parallel.
You are inviting a hungry wolf into your house to protect you from a bear. The wolf might scare off the bear, sure, but eventually the wolf is going to look at you and get hungry.
It is the profound danger of outsourcing your internal security and sovereignty to a massive external power. We see this dynamic in corporate alliances, and we see it constantly in politics.
Yes. People look at a political party or a charismatic politician and think, if only they be in absolute control, my community, my business, or my values will be permanently safe.
We project all our hopes for security onto an external institution that, at its core, only really cares about maintaining its own power.
Or on a personal level, we rely completely on a powerful mentor to carry our career, and we stop developing our own independent skills and networks.
Right. The illusion is that a larger external force can permanently solve your internal vulnerabilities. The Romans gladly signed those brass tablets, but they did not send a single legion to help Judas Maccabeus when he needed it most.
Which brings us to a vital practice for our listeners. Audit your dependencies. Look closely at your life and your work. Where are you relying on a Roman Senate to save you?
Is there a massive client that provides 90% of your revenue?
Is there a platform algorithm that you rely on entirely for your audience? How can you reclaim your independence and diversify your strength? Because if you wait for the Romans to come save you, you will be waiting forever.
You'll die waiting. And Judas does wait. But Rome does not arrive. The Seleucid Empire regroups, and in Chapter 9, Judas is forced to face his final, ultimate test entirely alone.
The Syrian king Demetrius sends a new general, Bacchides, with a massive army, 20,000 footmen and 2,000 horsemen.
A terrifying force.
They march swiftly into Judea. Judas pitches his camp at Alessa, but the years of relentless, grinding warfare have finally taken their toll on his forces. This time, Judas only has 3,000 men.
And when those 3,000 men look across the field and see the overwhelming scale of Bacchides' army, the psychological terror that Judas had managed to hold at bay for years finally breaks them.
They just couldn't do it anymore.
The text says that fear swept through the camp and the men slipped away. They desert in droves.
Out of 3,000 men, Judas is left with only 800.
800 exhausted insurgents against 22,000 professional soldiers.
The men who remain with Judas assess the situation, and they give him the most logical, pragmatic, mathematically sound military advice possible.
What do they tell him?
They beg him to retreat. They say, "We shall never be able. Let us now rather save our lives, and hereafter we will return with our brethren and fight against them, for we are but few."
Basically, run into the mountains, utilize the guerrilla tactics that worked before, and live to fight another day.
But Judas refuses to run. His response to them is iconic, really sealing his legacy into history. He says, "God forbid that I should do this thing and flee away from them. If our time be come, let us die manfully for our brethren, and let us not stain our honor."
Wow.
He charges into the battle. And the text describes a chaotic, brutal engagement that lasts from morning until night. Judas, fighting with the desperation of a lion cornered, actually manages to break the right wing of the Syrian army, pushing them back.
Which is incredible in itself.
But the left wing of the enemy swings around and entirely surrounds his small force. Judas is killed in the crush of combat.
And the remnant of his men flee.
Later, his brothers Jonathan and Simon manage to recover his body. They bury him in the ancestral tomb at Modin, where his father Mattathias had started the rebellion. And the text says, "All Israel wept for many days, crying, 'How is the valiant man fallen that delivered Israel?'"
It is a devastating, tragic conclusion to the life of one of history's great insurgent commanders.
It is. I have to admit, when I first read this, my modern sensibilities rebelled against his choice.
Really? How so?
Was this just foolish pride? By modern, pragmatic logic, Judas made a fatal error. He should have listened to his men, retreated, regrouped in the hills, and fought another day. I mean, why throw his life away in a battle he mathematically knew he could not win? Isn't that the exact same ego-driven vanity we just criticized in Joseph and Azarias?
It's a brilliant question, honestly. And it's one that historians and military strategists have debated. But if you evaluate his choice within the moral and psychological universe of this specific text, there's a profound distinction. No. Joseph and Azarias fought for personal glory, right? They directly disobeyed orders. Judas is the commander. He's the beating heart of the rebellion, and he is fighting to preserve the ethos of the entire movement.
Explain that mechanism to me. How does his death preserve the movement?
Because the Maccabean revolt was never merely a military campaign. It was a psychological and spiritual resistance against the absolute despair of assimilation.
Right.
Judas had become a symbol of absolute, uncompromising faith in the face of impossible odds. If Judas the Lion, the undefeated hero who told his men that victory doesn't rely on the size of an army, if he had turned his back and run away out of pure terror,
it would have shattered the psychological foundation of the rebellion.
Exactly. The people would have looked at that and said, if even Judas runs when the odds are bad, our cause is truly hopeless.
So his stand was a strategic psychological anchor.
Precisely. He realized that some defeats are necessary to preserve the moral core of a cause. By refusing to compromise his courage, by dying honorably, Judas cemented a legacy of absolute, unbreakable dedication.
He proved the point with his life.
His honorable defeat proved to the Judeans that their identity and their laws were worth dying for. And it was that specific legacy that provided his brothers, Jonathan and Simon, with the immense moral authority they needed to rally the fractured people, continue the grinding war for decades, and eventually achieve the political independence they sought.
It is the concept of the good failure. In our modern culture, we are pathologically obsessed with winning, with surviving, with hacking our way to success by any means necessary.
We really are.
But sometimes taking the loss while standing firmly by your principles is infinitely more valuable, both to your own soul and to the people watching you, than surviving through cowardice or moral compromise.
We see the modern echoes of this in various fields, actually. Think of a startup founder who has built a company with a strict ethical mission regarding user privacy.
Okay.
A massive conglomerate offers to buy them out for billions, but the founder knows the buyer will instantly violate those privacy ethics and exploit the users, so the founder refuses to sell.
And what happens?
Eventually, the conglomerate uses its market power to crush the startup, and the company goes under. The founder loses financially, but they keep their honor.
Or think of corporate or governmental whistleblowers. They know that speaking the truth about corruption is going to cost them their career, their reputation, and maybe even their freedom.
Pragmatically, they should stay quiet.
But they speak up anyway because running away and staying silent would stain their soul permanently.
They choose the honorable defeat over the compromised survival.
So the question for you to ask yourself in your own life is this. Are you willing to lose on your own terms to preserve your integrity? What does a good failure look like in your current struggles? Because sometimes the way you choose to lose defines your character and your legacy much more powerfully than the way you win.
It is a heavy, clarifying question. And as we step back and look at the broad sweep of these 9 chapters, from the eager assimilation in the gymnasium to Mattathias' violent zeal to the tactical brilliance of Judas and his ultimate sacrifice, you really realize what the author of this text considers the ultimate human failing.
If the ultimate virtue is this active, zealous courage, what is the ultimate sin?
Passivity, complacency, letting things happen to you without a fight.
Wow.
Throughout this entire narrative, the people who are condemned are those who simply go with the flow, who accept the empire's dictates because it's easier. The heroes of the text, regardless of their flaws, are defined by their fierce agency.
Give me an example.
Well, think of another of Judas's brothers, Eleazar, in chapter 6. During a massive battle, Eleazar sees a war elephant covered in royal armor. He assumes the king is riding it. In a wild, almost crazy act of zeal, he charges through the enemy lines, runs underneath the elephant, and stabs it from below.
And the elephant collapses and crushes him to death.
It does. It's tragic. And tactically, it didn't even win the battle, but the text remembers him with honor because he took his shot. He acted.
He had agency.
Yes. The ancient world, just like our modern world, was shaped by those who refused to be passive observers. They were actors on the stage, not just an audience. They fought. They adapted their sacred rules to survive. They made terrible ego-driven mistakes, and they died honorable deaths, but they never surrendered their agency to the empire.
They refused to let history simply happen to them. What a phenomenal, challenging takeaway. We don't have to be perfect. And we certainly don't have to win every single battle. We just have to be active participants in our own lives, refusing to quietly assimilate into the background when our values are on the line.
Absolutely.
That's the heart of this section. This is wisdom for the present, where understanding leads to clarity, and clarity shapes how we see and live. We'll see you in the next episode.